In this video, we are going to talk about Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Please subscribe and like our channel. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border in an all-out attack. The goal? To destroy the Soviet Union, eliminate communism, and secure vast lands and resources for the German Reich. Hitler believed the Red Army would collapse in just a few weeks, paving the way for a Nazi empire stretching across Europe and deep into Russia. But instead of a quick victory, the invasion turned into a brutal and devastating war of attrition, one that would ultimately lead to the downfall of Nazi Germany. Why did Germany invade the Soviet Union? Before the invasion, Germany and the Soviet Union had an uneasy alliance under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939. This agreement divided Eastern Europe between the two powers, allowing both to expand their influence. While Germany focused on conquering Western Europe, the Soviet Union occupied parts of Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland. But despite this pact, Hitler always intended to destroy the Soviet Union. He saw Slavic people as inferior, communism as a threat, and Soviet resources as the key to Germany's long-term survival. He called this plan Lebensraum, or living space, envisioning vast Soviet lands under German rule. After securing Western Europe, Hitler turned his attention east. By the spring of 1941, he was convinced that the Soviet Union was weak. Stalin had purged thousands of Soviet officers in the Great Purge, leaving the Red Army vulnerable. Hitler also underestimated the Soviet economy, believing Germany could capture vital oil fields, food supplies, and industrial centers to sustain the Nazi war machine. Confident in a swift victory, Hitler set June 22, 1941 as the day of the invasion. The invasion begins. Blitzkrieg strikes the Soviet Union. At dawn on June 22nd, the German war machine rolled forward. 3 massive army groups, Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South, launched a coordinated attack along an 1,800-mile front. German aircraft bombed Soviet airfields, destroying over 1,500 Soviet planes within hours. Panzer divisions raced deep into Soviet territory, cutting off entire Soviet units before they could react. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was in full effect. The initial results were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. In the first few weeks, entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and annihilated. Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell to the Germans. The Soviets suffered massive losses, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured. Stalin, in disbelief, refused to acknowledge the full scale of the invasion. For days, he did not address the Soviet people, and confusion spread across the Red Army. Meanwhile, the German advance continued with terrifying speed. Early German victories, the Soviet Union on the brink. As the summer of 1941 progressed, German forces moved closer to their key objectives: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the oil-rich Caucasus in the south. The German advance seemed unstoppable. In September, they surrounded Leningrad, beginning a brutal 900-day siege that would lead to the deaths of over 1 million civilians from starvation and bombardment. To the south, Kiev was encircled, and over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, the largest surrender in history. By October, the German army was approaching Moscow, the heart of Soviet power. Hitler believed victory was near. The Red Army had already lost over 2.5 million men, and German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. But then the tide began to turn. Soviet resistance. The Red Army fights back. Despite their heavy losses, the Soviet Union refused to surrender. Stalin ordered a massive defensive effort, calling upon millions of Soviet citizens to fight. Entire factories were dismantled and moved east, out of reach of the German advance. Partisan fighters ambushed German supply lines, slowing their momentum. In Moscow, civilians dug thousands of miles of trenches to block enemy tanks. Meanwhile, Stalin appointed General Georgy Zhukov, a brilliant strategist, to lead the defense of Moscow. By November 1941, the German army was exhausted. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles, and fuel shortages slowed their tanks. Then, the Russian winter arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and German troops, still wearing summer uniforms, suffered from frostbite. Vehicles froze, weapons jammed, and morale collapsed. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Soviet troops, many arriving from Siberia, attacked the weakened German lines. The Germans, unprepared for a winter war, were forced into retreat. Hitler, furious, ordered his men to stand their ground, but they were overwhelmed. The dream of capturing Moscow had crumbled. The turning point. The failure of Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa had begun with stunning German victories, but by early 1942, it was clear that Hitler's gamble had failed. The Soviet Union had survived the initial onslaught and was now mobilizing for total war. Germany, on the other hand, was now trapped in a brutal war of attrition on the Eastern Front, draining its manpower and resources. Over the next 3 years, the Soviet Union would push the Nazis back, culminating in the capture of Berlin in May 1945. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was one of the most important turning points of World War II. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and forced Hitler into a war he could not win. The Eastern Front became the deadliest battlefield in human history, with over 30 million casualties. The invasion that was meant to bring quick victory instead sealed Nazi Germany's fate. Conclusion: the cost of Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was more than just a military campaign. It was an ideological war of extermination. Hitler viewed the Soviet people as subhuman and sought to annihilate them. Entire villages were burned, civilians were massacred, and millions of Soviet prisoners were left to die in captivity. The war in the East became one of unimaginable brutality, with atrocities committed on both sides. In the end, the failure of Operation Barbarossa proved that even the most powerful armies could fall before the resilience and determination of a united people. The Soviet Union, once on the brink of collapse, would emerge as a global superpower, and Nazi Germany, which had once seemed unstoppable, had begun its slow and inevitable march toward defeat.